Good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of going through the canonical texts of Scripture. We have been moving through the Gospels and we included Acts into one entire video instead of doing two on it like we did the Gospels. And kind of moving forward, that's probably the way we're going to handle many of these subjects. We're going to actually take time, look at the internal and external evidence within one video if possible. Now, some of these, as I stated before, they're going to be in sections. Like we're going to do the Torah together. Today, we're doing three of the New Testament books together, known as the Pastoral Epistles. This is a very controversial one. In fact, I would say out of most of the emails or feedback I get about ones that people want me to do, they typically ask me to do the Pastoral Epistles. That has been a very popular request. So I figured we'd tackle it early. I've spent quite a while studying it behind the scenes before I actually jumped into it completely, because when I started looking at the data, I was a little bit blown away by some of the arguments that were made by those that believe it is not Paul, that it is a pseudo-Pauline epistle or epistles, and they believe that it is not Paul based on the internal evidence. Now, they recognize the external evidence, but they would eliminate all of that just off of the internal. We're going to talk about why that's bad technique. That's a bad way to do an examination of ancient text. Doesn't matter if it's scripture. It doesn't matter if it's Greco-Roman material. It doesn't matter if it's a biography or if it's some sort of literature that's relaying information that happened in history. That is not the only way you examine and determine a text. Now, when it comes to the authorship of this, it should be stated from the get-go that there is absolutely no dispute in the early church amongst the apostolic churches as to who wrote these letters. The problem resides internally, and so we must ask ourselves, how do we reconcile the problems? Let me give you the main point that is given by criticism, and then we'll actually go into the material. The main criticism from what really began probably around the 1800s, maybe early 1800s, men in Germany, particularly around 1807, started putting a hypothesis together that demonstrated that these were not Pauline for two reasons. Number one, as I stated, the internal evidence doesn't seem Pauline. And what I mean by that, and what they mean by that, is that this can't be Paul. There's too many words in these three epistles that are not in the other epistles of Paul. A second reason that is given is on the basis of the fact that some of the material in 1st and 2nd Timothy seem to oppose the teaching of Gnosticism, which some would maintain is later. So that can't be Paul. This would be after Paul. Gnosticism became more prevalent after the destruction of the temple, not before, and Paul died before the destruction of the temple. Now, that is semi-true in the sense that it became dominant in the post-70 AD, and John the Apostle dealt with that more than Paul the Apostle did. But the origins of what is known as Gnosticism did start its ugly head in the 60s. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to look at both those aspects, and we're going to try to answer both those, both historically and internally. But just from the beginning, I would reject the idea or the notion that, well, the dominant side of Gnosticism, particularly with Cerinthianism, hit in post-70 AD. That's more Johannine fighting back, 1 John, the intro to John. That kind of thing seems to be more Gnosticism issue than Paul dealing with it in the 60s. Well, again, dominant, yes, post-70. Origins are pre-70, and we're going to see some church citations of understanding what was going on at that time. Going back to the first reason they give is that it is not possible to be Paul because it doesn't really fit his language. Well, that's something to consider, and we're going to take that into consideration. But let's first, before we jump internally, start with an identified person of interest. We've done this all through the Gospels. We're going to do it again. We need a person of interest in history, or multiple, whatever the case may be. There may be 4 or 5 hypotheses, or maybe one historian saying this guy wrote it, one historian saying this guy wrote it. Whatever the case may be, we need to put all possibilities on the table. And when it comes to the pastoral epistles, those that wrote of them have only given one name. Now, Irenaeus being one of the earliest that I would give, he was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. very early church father who had access to quite a bit of the apostolic tradition through Polycarp and John the Apostle. And this is what he had to say. And I'm going to give two quotes from him from Against Heresies, book 3. And this is in chapter 3. It says, the blessed apostles, then having founded and built up the church, committed into the hands of Linus the office of the episcopator, that is the oversight, the oversee. Of this Linus, Paul makes mention in his epistles to Timothy. Now, what he's describing here is 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 21, which is an important identifier of what Irenaeus is saying. He's talking about Linus, who is given over to the office of the episcopate, but he also had apostolic influence. He was a companion of Paul. He identifies him as the Linus that Paul mentions in the closing of 2 Timothy chapter 4. But notice what Irenaeus states about 2 Timothy 4. He says, of this Linus, Paul makes mention. I want to highlight the idea of that. One, he associates this with Paul, but he states that Paul mentioned it. Now, there could be two aspects to this. One is simply that could be a general statement. It could apply to a written form or him saying it to somebody to write it down. And you could be looking into it a little bit too much and say, well, that's awfully curious that he didn't say he wrote it there, but he actually mentioned it. I don't think we should spend too much time on this point, but I do want to highlight he doesn't say wrote as he wrote in his epistle to Timothy. He makes mention of him in his epistle to Timothy. So with that, there could be a hint here from Irenaeus. Now, again, a writer and an author could be the same, or it could be different, meaning you can have an author who has an amanuensis or a scribe who writes on behalf of you, and you're telling them what to write. You are still writing it. It is still considered your epistle, even if somebody's hand is writing your words for you. We talked about that particularly with Mark's gospel on behalf of Peter. And there's other places that takes place in the New Testament as well. We talked about Romans, Paul used an amanuensis named Tertius. He signs off his name there at the end of chapter 16. But here, Irenaeus states not that he wrote it, but actually that he made mention of it. And then in the next chapter of that same section in book 3 of Against Heresies, Irenaeus actually mentions Polycarp. He says, Polycarp himself replied to Marcion, who met him on one occasion. So he's identifying the fact that the heretic Marcion came across the path of Polycarp. And he said, and this is what Marcion said to Polycarp, do you know who I am? Or do you know me? And this is Polycarp's response. I do know you, the firstborn of Satan. Now, we could do a whole show on the ow factor right there. Like, ouch, that was harsh. That was quite incredible of a statement for Polycarp to make. I mean, and especially looking at the readings about Polycarp and those who have written of his life, or the way that Ignatius talks about him when he wrote a personal letter to him. He seemed to be a calm, kind-hearted spirit. But Marcion had stirred such great distress, great contention by mutilating Paul's letters, specifically the Gospel of Luke. At this point, there is great contention between the heretic Marcion and the apostolic leaders of these churches because they're cleaning up his mess. And so Polycarp called him the firstborn of Satan. It says, such was a horror which the apostles and their disciples, being Polycarp the disciple, had against holding even verbal communication with any of these corrupters of the truth. As Paul also says, a man that is a heretic after the first and second admonition, reject, knowing that he is subverted in sins, being condemned himself. And that is a quotation from Titus chapter 3, verse 10. Now notice the wording that we have here. Irenaeus said, just as Paul said, and then quotes Titus 3, giving Paul credit for the wording of Titus chapter number 3, just as he gave credit to him for 2 Timothy chapter 4. But notice again, he doesn't say as Paul wrote in his epistle. He says as Paul says. Again, we could be reading into that too much, and that could indicate, because if you're writing it, you're saying it, that could be the case, or he knows of a little bit more tradition of how these epistles came to be. Given the fact that he says Paul says and Jesus says, and then quotes a written text, could exclude that possibility, but it's something to keep in the back of our minds as a possibility. Also, after him, we have the Muratorian Fragment, which we have referenced a few times in our Gospels. It mentions quite a bit about Paul's epistles as well. It's a little bit lengthy, but I'll read it to you, and I'll stop and pause on the parts that I really want to spend my time dealing with, and we'll actually come back and highlight one section here. It says, for as the epistles of Paul, they themselves make clear that to those that desiring to understand which ones they are, from what place or what reason they were sent, it is necessary for us to discuss one by one, since the blessed apostle Paul himself writes by name to only 7 churches in the following sequence. Now he says Paul's writing, and then he particularly talks about a church letter being the Corinthians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Galatians, Thessalonians, and Romans. It is true that he writes once more to the Corinthians and to the Thessalonians for the sake of admonition. Yet it is clearly recognized that there is one church spread throughout the whole extent of the earth. Paul also wrote out of affection and love, one to Philemon, one to Titus, 2 to Timothy. And these are held sacred in the esteem of the universal church for the regulation of ecclesiastical discipline. Okay, we're going to come back to the first section. I want to focus on the second section. It says these 4 being the letters of Paul, which included 4 personal letters, Philemon, 2 to Timothy, 1 to Titus. They are held as sacred, particularly that is the 4 specific individual written letters, in esteem for the universal church to regulation of the ecclesiastical discipline. They were important to the church. They were utilized in the church. They were followed in the church and practiced in the church as apostolic authority text from Paul. So by the end of the 2nd century, the Muratorian Fragment is stating that these epistles, including the 4 individual written ones, 2 to Timothy, 1 to Titus, 1 to Philemon, are authoritative and apostolic from Paul himself. There's a third paragraph in the Muratorian Fragment that I want to point out, because lest we believe that the church just received anything in the name of Paul, we need to recognize that the church recognized that they were trying to be deceived, or they were being deceived by Marcion and others who allowed written texts to come into the church with Paul's name on them. Notice this in this third paragraph. There is current also an epistle to the Laodiceans and another to the Alexandrians, both forged in Paul's name to further the heresy of Marcion, and several others which cannot be received in the universal church, for it is not fitting that gall should be mixed with honey. This is what the writer of the Muratorian Fragment is telling us, that there are other letters with Paul's name in them. The church knows about them. He lists 2 by name, Alexandrian and Laodicean text. These are given by Paul's name, but yet they knew they were forged. They knew they weren't from Paul. And then he says there's others that cannot be received. The churches will not receive them. Why? Because of what he just told you in the 2nd paragraph before that, and that these are held as sacred in esteem to the universal church for regulation in ecclesiastical discipline, because these texts are traced to the apostle Paul himself. And if it can be traced to Paul and it's instructional, especially for ecclesiastical discipline, it must be held in a place of authority and sacredness. These others with Paul's names cannot be traced, and even to the time of the Muratorian Fragment states, we have these other texts in Paul's names, but we know they're not Paul, they're forgeries. Why? Because the churches had never received them from Paul at any point. So the Muratorian Fragment is telling us that these letters were written by Paul and that they knew of others that were not. This isn't a matter of just, well, the early church would just accept anything. Paul knew that his name was being forged, even as he wrote books like Galatians. He knew his work was being used to manipulate people under his name. And the churches were identifying those epistles. This wasn't, and again, I know there's good Christian guys out there that are trying to like make themselves still fit in the modern crowd of scholarship, which again, nothing wrong with trying to be intelligent and even fit into the crowd a little bit. And they're trying to hold to the position, well, this is still Paul in a way. It's not Paul himself, but later writers for Paul. So it still can be canonical, even though it's not Paul himself. It's people that had Paul's work. Now, let me be clear about this. Though that sounds great, and we can try to reconcile things that way by saying, well, this is pseudo Paul, but it's not a forgery because it's still Pauline material. As if we're trying to explain some of the differences in Isaiah, which we'll get to another time. I don't think that's what's happening here. In fact, there's a major problem. If it's not Paul, it is a forgery. Because in all of these pastoral epistles, it claims to be Paul writing to an individual. And if somebody 20, 30 years later after Paul decided to collect something for Paul and publish it with a recipient and its writer with the name Paul, it is a forgery. That's what it is. So it's either a forgery or it's not. We can't middle ground this too much. There's a lot of room for why there's differences, which we'll come back to, but there is no room for whether or not Paul was behind it. He was either behind it as the authority behind it. Whether he wrote it or not by hand is irrelevant to if it's Pauline. But either Paul was doing it in his lifetime by his own hand or the hand of someone else he used, or it wasn't Paul. I do not see room for middle ground. I've listened to the arguments. I have men I respect who gave arguments for it, and I don't think it works. I don't think it works. These writers in the 2nd century knew of Pauline letters in his name that were not from Paul. These were not in that category. In fact, they were held in high esteem as sacred and used as authoritative for ecclesiastical discipline. Now, we're going to come back to that first paragraph in a second. But in keeping with that, Tertullian the lawyer in North Africa says this and against Marcion, to this epistle, being Philemon, alone did its brevity avail to protect it against the falsifying hands of Marcion. I wonder, however, when he received this letter, which was written but to one man, that he rejected the 2 epistles to Timothy and the 1 to Titus, which all treat of ecclesiastical discipline. His aim was, I suppose, to carry out his... Now, listen. Before I continue reading, I want you to catch on to what he's saying. Now, Tertullian is saying exactly what the Muratorian Fragment just said. He puts Philemon and the 2 epistles to Timothy and Titus in the same category. But he notices something about it, that they were not touched by Marcion. Only the others, and particularly Luke's gospel, was mutilated. But when it came to interpolating, he says that he tried to carry out his interpolating process even to the number of St. Paul's epistles. He realized that that did happen in Paul's other letters, like to the churches. But Tertullian's investigating why he didn't touch the ones that are to the pastoral, what we call the pastoral epistles in Philemon, which are individual letters. Do you see what Tertullian did, though? He categorically separated the personal letters from the public or the congregational letters that he wrote to the churches as a whole. And even Marcion, in his mutilating process, excluded the work of the personal letters, and Tertullian's trying to investigate why. He assumes it has to do with brevity. Now, some actually use Marcion as a reason to reject Paul. They would say, well, Marcion didn't mutilate those, therefore they're not Pauline. Because Marcion only went after the Pauline letters. For 2 things. Number 1, are then you conceding, if that's your argument in defense, are you conceding in the scholastic world that you exist in, that also Luke is written by Luke and authored by Paul because Marcion believed Luke's gospel was Paul's. So if you're going to take that as the standard, as Marcion's lack of usage or usage, meaning if Marcion used it, then it was Pauline, and if Marcion tried to mutilate it, then it's Pauline, then are you willing to concede by Marcion's own words that Luke is Paul's? That's something to consider. 2, most of the modern scholars who reject the Pauline authority behind the Pastoral Epistles do not reject Philemon. And Marcion, according to Tertullian here, did not go after Philemon either. So you're at odds with Luke and you're at odds with Philemon here. So if Marcion's the standard, we have a bad standard. I would say that Tertullian's reasoning is correct more than anything. It's the brevity of these letters. And because they were written to individuals, that makes it more difficult. If it's written to the ecclesiastical church, it's easier to corrupt something that's given to a general assembly than a specific individual. There's multiple reasons I think that Tertullian tried to investigate as to why. His biggest reason was alone in its brevity availed to protect it. He believed because it was short, it protected it. And he wondered why he didn't touch the other personal letters. But see the correlation between Tertullian there and the Muratorian Fragment. You have a connection between them because they're individual personal letters. And again, we're going to come back to that again. I'm going to keep going through historical testimony and attestation. Origen in the 2nd century said this on the 2nd letter of Timothy. Some have dared to reject this epistle, but they were not able. Now, why? Now, he said that in his commentary actually on Matthew. The question is why would Origen say that? Why would Origen say there were some that dared to reject it, but weren't able to do it? Because this goes back to a little bit of what the Muratorian Fragment was telling us a minute ago, that in this pursuit, there was an attempt actually to discredit Pauline's authorship into the epistles of Timothy and Titus. Origen's telling us a little bit why. Now, before Origen came Clement of Alexandria, and I think this is probably the reason why Origen was saying there were some who dared to do this. But as the Muratorian Fragment told us, universally, the churches were obeying the authority of Paul in them. But there was a fight. It was a fringe fight, hence the word some dared to reject it. But what Origen's probably going off of is what the guy before him, Clement of Alexandria, investigated about this matter himself. There was only one dispute about Pauline authorship in the ancient church, and it wasn't from the apostolic churches, or as they keep saying, the universal churches. It was from the heretical churches, being Gnostic churches and Gnostic faith systems. Notice what it says here in Clement's writing of Gnosticism in his Stromata, book 2, chapter 11. It says, as then philosophy has been brought into evil repute by pride and self-conceit, so also gnosis or knowledge by false gnosis or knowledge, called by the same name, of which the apostle writing says, now he does say he wrote this. Now, context here matters. Earlier in this section, Clement had already established this, the apostle that's writing as Paul, because he states it earlier that Paul is the writer, and he's talking about the same writer as Romans. So he's the writer of Romans and the writer of what he's about to say are linked contextually back to Paul. So he's saying, Paul, the writer, says, O Timothy, keep that which is committed to your trust, avoiding the profane and vain babblings and oppositions of knowledge or gnosis, falsely so called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith. And what he's quoting there is 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 20 through 21. Now notice what Clement of Alexandria says in conclusion to this. Convicted by this utterance, the heretics rejected the epistles to Timothy. So what Clement is telling us is there are some that could not stomach Paul's opposition to their new form knowledge, the gnosis, because he's saying, look, it's the same name, knowledge. Paul's all about knowledge, but there's a form of knowledge that brings out vain babblings in opposition to true knowledge. And Paul would have been combating the Gnostics and their view of knowledge. Now, this is why early German scholars in the early 1800s would say, can't be Paul. He's combating Gnosticism. It's definitely not him. Wait a minute. There were earlier traces of Gnosticism in the 60s. Paul apparently experienced it. It's possible and completely possible he was dealing with it very, very in its earliest stages. So much that the Gnostics did not utilize the Pastoral Epistles because they didn't like its conviction, as he uses here, the word for conviction, against their teachings. So they disregarded it. And as Origen says, some have dared to reject the epistle and they were not able. It's very likely that Origen's talking about what Clement's talking about, and that is Gnostic sects came in and their form of knowledge was being combated in its earliest stages by Paul, and they wanted no part of that. Origen also says in his works against Celsius in book 1 in 63, moreover, Paul, who himself also at a latter time became an apostle of Jesus, says in his epistle to Timothy. Now catch it. He says this in his epistle to Timothy. This is a faithful saying that Jesus Christ came to the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. So again, there you have 1 Timothy, you have 2 Timothy, you have these admonitions. They recognize them as Paul. Last one on the historical attestation, Jerome, letter 53, said this: the Apostle Paul writes to Timothy, who had been trained in the holy writings from a child, exhorting him to study them diligently. 2 Timothy 3:14 and 15 is what he's referencing. And not to neglect the gift that was given to him by the laying hands of the elders. 1 Timothy 4:14 is what he's referring to. To Titus, he gives commandment that among the bishops, other virtues which are briefly described, he should be careful to seek a knowledge of the scriptures. A bishop, he says, must hold fast to the faithful word as he's been taught, that he may be able to stand with sound doctrine and to exhort and convince the gainsayer. So he's quoting Titus 1:9. So you have Jerome saying it goes back to Paul. You have the Muratorian Fragment. You have Irenaeus. You have Clement. You have Origen. We have all of this information that is pointing us to the fact, historically, we have one author behind these epistles. And all the churches, whether you're talking about North Africa, where Tertullian was, down in Alexandria, where Clement and Origen were, or whether you're talking about in the East with Irenaeus, or you're talking about the Muratorian Fragment, the churches universally, and they use that term universally, had never disputed who was behind the letters of 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. They all said it was Paul. All of them. Every one of them. The only opposition to him were Gnostic sects who did not like him opposing their new form of knowledge. And as Origen said, they failed. So what does this mean? So how do we reconcile these things? How do we deal with this dilemma in the pastorals? Because historically, there's no debate. In fact, there was no debate till the 1800s. So historically, we, on the side that believe it is actually Pauline, have a person of interest from historical criteria where we have corroborated the testimony of these different men from different parts of the world who are part of the same group of apostolic churches who had letters distributed and copied and sent out on all parts of the world, all saying it's Paul. And went so far as to say, we know of other letters that are circulating with Paul's name on them that are forged. It's not like, again, it's not like the churches are just like, man, if it's got Paul's name on it, we should take it in. It's great stuff. They needed it to be traced to apostolic authority to use it. Now, it was used early in church letters too, and I'll give some data from my dissertation from Codex H. And First Clement, which is anywhere from 90 to 98 AD, end of the first century. First Clement quotes Titus 3:1, quotes 1 Timothy 1:17. From 110 to 135, you have Polycarp to the Philippians. He quotes 2 Timothy 2:12, 2 Timothy 4:1, 2 Timothy 4:10, 1 Timothy 2:2, 1 Timothy 6:7, 1 Timothy 6:10. Ignatius, who's a little bit before Polycarp and actually wrote letters to Polycarp before his execution in Rome, He references the Pastoral Epistles as authoritative. The early church was utilizing it very early on. And when I mean early, I mean first century early. They had already utilized it as apostolic, authoritative, and worthy of Scripture. And then these church fathers are telling us where they came from and some battles that came over them. They were not disputed. Eusebius even goes on to include that, says there was 14 of these. It's an amazing thing that we have all of this historical attestation to one individual only to these letters. And then we come to modern scholarship or new scholarship that started finding itself in Europe, particularly in Germany around 1800s. And all of a sudden, because words are different, it can't be Paul. Now, the question is, do we ignore that? Well, first of all, let me say this. What you'll hear from terminology today is this: the consensus of scholars reject these as Paul. The consensus of scholars reject these as Paul. Okay, two things. One, I want to see the official consensus. We need to stop saying those things without actual data. At the British New Testament Conference, they did a survey on the Pauline authorships at the BNTC. My good friend Elijah Hickson sent me this data a while back. I've kind of kept it on file. It goes through all of Paul's letters. They did a vote. There's about 108 to 109 people voting. It's a mixture of scholars in Britain, some from the universities, and just well-rounded men who come together and talk about the New Testament, things like that. They did a vote on the authority behind the alleged Paul's epistles. And I notice here in the 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, there was 107 votes for 1 Timothy. 23 said it was. Now you say that's low. It is. 59 said it's not. But 25 said they're not sure. They're uncertain. It's not as lopsided as people say. The consensus of scholars does not say, now again, I know this is one group, one country, one conference, but at least they did a survey. Yeah, 59 people said, I don't think it's Paul. 25 said, I do. And then the other 25 are over here like, not sure. I'm undecided. 2 Timothy, 26 said yes, 58 said no, 24 said undecided. Titus, 25 said yes, 62 said no, 21 said undecided. The consensus is not as lopsided as people think. That's the point I want to make here. No, the majority doesn't believe it's Paul. And in some of these letters, it's almost 50-50 with the consensus of, no, it's definitely not him, and those that say yes and not sure. It's almost 50-50 of the uncertainty or the disgruntledness about whether it is or not. Some aren't willing to place their vote anywhere. So they're not a part of the consensus that says no because they're uncertain. The consensus of saying no is not in the majority the way that the scholars want us to believe. So what do we do with this? Every program, my goal is to take us through the internal evidence in addition to the external evidence we have from history. Now, we just went through a whole list of historical attestation for it, but I want to bring us back to the Muratorian Fragment because there was something that was said in there. When I was studying for this and I was researching this, I was actually blown away. I saw something that I really never paid attention to before. It's pretty simple. It says, Paul also wrote out of affection and love, 1 to Philemon, 2 to Timothy, 1 to Titus. Okay. The Muratorian Fragment is telling us that Paul wrote these 4 with a different disposition. And my brain started moving. Because in keeping that with Tertullian, remember, he kept Philemon and the pastorals together too. I'm like, okay, why is that? This common sense thought hit me out of thin air. Okay, if I'm writing a business email and I'm sending it to a group of business partners dealing with problems and upcoming things, inventory, data, issues, and I type out that email. And then, on the other hand, I write out a text message or I write out some kind of letter to my mom and my wife or my daughter or my son or something like that. I'm going to use a very different vocabulary and approach to the way I write those to a business letter that is very general. Think about this, folks. Let's bring this to reality. Is it fair to compare a personal letter or letters to the rest of Paul's epistles to congregations? Think about this. He's writing to the Corinthian church about massive problems. They were arguing and bickering over whether they liked him or Cephas or Apollos better. They were getting drunk on the Eucharist. People are sleeping with their stepmoms. They're carnal. Then you have Romans, which is an extremely doctrinal treatise to the church at Rome, dealing with the depths of their soteriology, dealing with their position in Christ, dealing with their eternal understanding of grace. Would Paul be writing the same terminology for that kind of stuff as he would a personal letter to somebody who traveled with him and he's invested his life in, that he calls my son in the faith? There's going to be a disposition and a difference between writing one of those and the other. So it dawned on me, should we be comparing the Pastoral Epistles language to all the other epistles or to another personal letter? Now, it just so happens that Philemon is an undisputed book. Almost anybody would accept it as Pauline. In fact, the consensus at the BNTC conference, let's see, Philemon was 108 votes, believe it was Paul, 0 did not, and 1 was uncertain. I would say that one's pretty lopsided. I'm pretty sure we can say that is the consensus. So the consensus of scholars would say Philemon is undisputed. So what I decided to do is say, okay, I'm going to use the Muratorian Fragment as a springboard here to an idea. He's saying that there's terms of endearment, compassion, and love that are found within these 4 that are distinct from the other epistles. So what I decided to do is take the book of Philemon, because it's undisputed, and take all of the syntax and the vocab out of it in Greek and to trace it back into the pastorals and see if I could find how much of the wording that Paul used in Philemon is in 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. I think that's more comparable. It's the same genre. It's a personal letter. It's not a corporate letter. So I did some investigation. It took me a while. And what I did in my research is I pulled out words and phrases that are used in Philemon, and I backtracked them into the pastorals to see if they were there. Now, I didn't do every single word. Like, I didn't do conjunctions like kai or de or anything like that, because or the pronouns of alto, altas, altan, etc. Unless they were significant to a phrase, because they were obviously used in phrases that were Pauline. If they were just individual words, I didn't count those because they're automatically in those. So I tried to be fair with this. I could have easily said, yep, there's another word that's in 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. There's another conjunction. There's another personal pronoun. There's another third person pronoun. I could have done that and given a higher percentage. I could have done that in my research. I chose to abstain from that and just focus on major word and major phrase that Paul would have used or not used. Major vocab words, major syntax. I didn't go with the everybody uses the same conjunction kind of thing. Everybody has the understanding of the pronouns and usages or articles, things like that. So what I came up with in my research of total major words and phrases combined was a total of 162 together. 162. What I did is I put them in the verse sections, and if it was a match, I highlighted it in red. If it was a difference, I highlighted it in blue. If it was, let's just say if it was a neutral word, and let me explain what those are because I gave 2 percentages based on this because, again, I'm trying to be fair. A neutral word is a word that Paul would have known. The root word of it is used in the pastorals, but the form in which it's used there, I chose to just throw it out. Instead of giving bias to, well, that he obviously knew the word. Let me give you a perfect example. It may have been used as a noun form over here and used as a verb form over there. Clearly, he knew the word. He used one as a verb, used one as a noun, and one letter to the other. But what I did is I threw it out and neutralized it. I just neutral. Now, there's only 8 total. Excuse me. Actually, there's 4 of those. There's 4 others I neutralized, and that is words that were only used to Philemon and Philemon only. They're not in any of Paul's letters. I excluded them from the count, just like I excluded the obvious ones like de and kai and alto, alton, altos, etc. So I neutralized 8 total, but I did give a stat even with those 4 that I just told you were not used anywhere else but Philemon. In fact, I might even try to bring this up on the screen for you to see some of the idea of what I did, because I think this is really important to get the data together. I'm going to give you the stats, and then I'm going to try to pull this up for you. Let me share my screen real quick. And to those that are listening to this on fax and aren't able to, I apologize. You'll just have to listen to the writing. Let's see if I can get it in here. Yeah, it's on the screen. Actually, let me switch the size of this. All right, this is the work that I did right here. As you can see, this is verse 1, verse 2, verse 3. You'll see colors, and I know some of you probably have a hard time seeing this on your screen. The red is an exact word. The blue here is a non-exact word, and this one's going to be obvious. Philemon and Archippus and Apphia being probably the wife of Philemon, and Archippus would have probably been an elder pastor in the church. So naturally, you're going to expect differences there. And I actually will show you how I eliminated names, including ones that were in Paul's pastoral epistles. There's some word differences here. Koinonia, sharing, is not used anywhere else in the pastorals, but is only used here. Then there's phrases like of your faith. So you see these here, like it was used in 1 Timothy 3, 4, 4, 6, 6. All this I've done, laid out, even using some of the exact terminology, like some of them are the same word, but one might be used like here for the dative usage. Agatho was used in 1 Timothy 5, but the genitive was also used in 1 Timothy 2. The accusative, agathon, and 2 Timothy 2:1, 3:17, Titus 1:16, 3:1. So there are times where obviously it's the same word, but used in a different form. Those are matches being used. And then there's green, like I talked about here. And he says that he's had been refreshed. And I leave a note here, and I'm going to read it to you to those that can't see this. It says similar idea is used in actually 2 Timothy 1:16 with the word that it was Onesiphorus that actually he said he often refreshed me. The origins of the word go back to the same place. But I wanted to be careful with root words because root words don't mean that somebody actually used forms of that root word regularly. They might choose one and run with it and never use another. So I try to be careful with that. But they do go back to the same root where he says, he refreshed me often, talking about Onesiphorus in 2 Timothy chapter number 1. But he also uses that terminology for Philemon and his relationship there and how he relates to the other brothers in verse 7. So what I did is I neutralized a word like that. So I highlighted it in green. So you see the data here, and at the end of each verse, I did how many major words there were. Like for right here in verse number 11, I have there's 6 major words. One of them is used twice. It's the same word, it's used twice. 6 are read for a total of 19 usages. So 6 words were used in verse 11 of Philemon. One was a duplicate. And it totaled, if you go to the pastorals, well, how often did Paul use that in the pastorals? 19 total times between those 6 words. One word correlated with the opposite and so forth, which I'm actually going to discuss that one in a minute. So there's different, like 4 here, there's 8 here, there's 7 here, there's 6 here in verse number 15. There's 12 in number 16. And in that one, there's 11 that are red, and there's 1 that is green, and there's one that's blue, excuse me, which means there's a difference that's not used in the pastoral. So this is what I decided to do and bring out the data that way. All right. Can we trace these back to the pastorals? Let me give you the total numbers that I've come up with. So out of the major words and phrases, there's roughly 160 plus. I'm going to say give or take because I'm still editing some of this stuff and it can go up or down. I'm going to say 160 or so. Out of the 160, there's 131 or so that actually agree. So out of 160, there's 130 that are used in the pastorals. There's 23 or so blue, meaning there's differences, and 8 that I told you are neutralized, 4 of which are words that are never used anywhere else but Philemon. 4 are root connections, like I showed you for the word refreshed there in 2 Timothy 1. Now, here's the thing. This is the thing that I struggle with modern scholarship. I'm seeing numbers like, well, in the pastoral epistles, we have 40% words or vocab or syntax that is not in any of the other Paul's epistles. I've seen as high as 60. And it's like, wait a minute, how are we so far? Like one guy says 40, one guy says 60. That's a big difference. The question that has to come to is how are we counting differences? And that became very obvious by the time I started verse 1, doing Philemon comparisons, being a personal letter with the other 3 personal letters to the pastoral epistles. So it's like, okay, so how are we counting this? Are we saying that it's got to be an exact word? Are we saying it's got to be the exact form? Are we saying that if it's a genitive in here, but he doesn't ever use it as a nominative here, it doesn't count? I don't know. The lists are very limited, and the only ones that are actually producing lists are people that actually stand behind the Pauline. So how are we counting this? Also, compound words. I noticed this, for example, like if you go to verse 1, he calls him a fellow laborer. The word for labor is actually very unique because it's one that Paul almost exclusively uses in the pastorals. He talks about a workman that doesn't need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. The difference is the term, the compound of it, the fellow worker, is not used in the pastorals together. But Paul uses both words in separate categories in the pastorals and regularly. But in Philemon, he merges the 2 words together. Am I to believe that Paul didn't know what fellow and laborer was? That he never used those terminologies in other epistles? Well, he did. He just merged them together and called him a fellow laborer. Folks, we do this. It's like, it's an uphill battle from here. 2 words, uphill. It's compound, uphill. A person that understands the concept of uphill probably understands the idea of up and a hill. Just because somebody doesn't use them separately or somebody doesn't use them together in another place doesn't mean they don't understand it. So again, how are we counting these? I try to take those things into consideration. Yes, the whole word together, fellow labor, which is 2 Greek words put into 1 word, is not used in the pastorals, but the idea of fellow and labor are regularly used in the pastorals, and Paul would have known both. So how are we counting these? I think that should be taken into consideration. Another thing, names. I don't expect Paul to have Philemon's name, Archippus's name, Aphia's name in any of the pastorals because they live in Colossae. He's writing to a guy in Crete and a guy in Ephesus. I don't expect him to use people in Colossae's names in either one of those letters and vice versa. Now, there are names that are the same. Luke is mentioned. Demas is mentioned. Mark is mentioned, actually. Now, it is important to note that, though, even though I did not count them for and against, because there's differences, you naturally expect numbers to be, or names to be different. I excluded them, even the ones that agree. But the fact that Luke, Mark, and Demas are mentioned in Philemon, and Demas is only mentioned elsewhere in 2 Timothy, and Mark is only mentioned in 2 Timothy. Now, Luke is mentioned in Colossians, and he said in 2 Timothy 4, Luke is the only one with him. But he actually gives more narrative to what happened to Demas. He tells us in 2 Timothy 4 that Demas forsook him, having loved this present age. He mentions to bring Mark because now he's profitable. So he mentions these guys in Philemon, and their stories are being kind of told and how they developed over the years, which would indicate 2 Timothy is later, much later, after John Mark issues. It would have been after Demas went off and abandoned Paul. So there's actually a completion of the story of the names there. So that should be taken into consideration too. These names are only found in that group together in 2 Timothy 4. But again, I'm not counting them as vocab and syntax. So I excluded them. So you have 6 blue names and 8 green neutral words. You have 4 names that are the same, and I excluded them. So that puts us closer down. That puts us around 145 words, roughly. Divided by, which now is an agreement. No longer, I said 131 read, but when we start taking out names and things like that, we're closer to 127. 125 to 127. When you do the division, that puts you at about 88%, roughly. 86 to 88%. Now, I went ahead and excluded and said, all right, if I just took the green words that are unique to Philemon and still counted them with the blue, even though they're not in the pastorals, yes, but they're also not in the other epistles, yes, let's just include them in the blue and say they're different too, and just leave the names. Just leave the root word ones. It's still around 86%. So I'm going to say roughly, because my math can be adjusted as I continue to edit this, 85 to 88% of the language and syntax in Philemon can be found in the pastorals, meaning you can restruct with the language and syntax of 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, 85 to 88% of Philemon. You can reconstruct that epistle with that data, give or take. To me, this is more comparable than comparing it to general epistle, general congregation issues. He's writing personal. And I believe the Muratorian Fragment is onto something. I believe the Muratorian Fragment is giving us indicators that he wrote out of compassion and love toward these individuals, whereas the others are more business-oriented. Not that he didn't love the churches, but that they were business-related. But with those numbers, that also needs to be into consideration. Not just that there's names that connect in 2 Timothy 4 that are there only in Philemon, nowhere else together. There's also 4 words used in Philemon that can't be found in any of other Paul's epistles except the pastorals. Now, I'm going to give you some important words. So again, when we're counting, are we just counting numbers and doing math? Are we actually examining Paul's usage? Like, man, that is really Pauline and Pauline only. Let me give you some examples. In verse 9 of Philemon, he uses the word presbytos. Now, Paul uses the term elder quite a bit. It's not unique to any of the pastoral or Philemon. But he uses the form presbytos, which is from particularly about an old man in the sense of his age, not in the sense of his position title in the church. In the way that Paul's using it as an older man, not an elder in the church, but an older man, here and in Titus 2:2 is the only place where Paul refers to aged men that way. Again, he uses the term in Greek elsewhere, but presbytos for the form of the aged man that he does here is only in Titus 2:2 and in Philemon 1:9. Verse 10, and this one I think is huge. And it only counts as one connection. It only counts as one connection in the red that I showed you. But it's worth more than one connection. Not that I counted it as worth more, because I gave you the math. But my point is, there's more to the math than the math. That math represents identity. That math represents important terminology. That math represents words that can connect us to usages that Paul is very, very known for, He refers to Onesimus, who has been converted, as his son, but he doesn't use the term huios. He uses the word what techno or teknon. He uses that term, the singular of this same form, that he calls Onesimus his son or child, is what he calls Timothy, techno, in 1 Timothy 1:2 and 2 Timothy 1:2. And he calls Titus that in Titus 1:4. And then he uses the word teknon in 1 Timothy 1:18 and 2 Timothy 2:1. Now, the term is an endearing term. It's a term of intimacy. It's not that Paul is their physical father, but that he's their spiritual father. They were probably all saved under his ministry and trained by him. Folks, it is only in Philemon that you see Onesimus is called a son by Paul, a teknon. And Timothy and Titus are the only ones that are ever called that. You see, there's a connection here that's bigger than one single statistic. Now, I think that's important to consider, and it's not something that should be easily ignored, because Paul is looking at this from the time. Let's go back to the Muratorian Fragment argument. Out of love and compassion, he wrote 1 to Philemon, 2 to Timothy, 1 to Titus. This is a term of love. This is a term of endearment. Looking at these men that he's writing to as, or in the case of Onesimus, about, he's writing about them as a person who loves them like a father. So maybe the Muratorian Fragment's right. Maybe these should be categorically different. Maybe they should be compared, because the disposition of Paul is different in the personal letters from the corporate, which means we're going to find words that are not in the other epistles that are in those, because there's personalized touches on them. Like here. Another term, archreston or euchreston. The archreston is useless. The euchreston is useful. That terminology where he says to Philemon about, by the way, he doesn't, going back to what I just said a minute ago, he doesn't call Philemon a son. He calls him a brother. He only calls Onesimus a son. Back to what I was saying. Useless and useful. He tells Philemon, he was once useless or unprofitable. Now he is profitable to you and to me, which is an important phrase, because he uses this adjective as an adjective, and it's only used in this way here in Philemon 1:11 and in 2 Timothy 2:21, and another form of it in 2 Timothy 4:11. Again, it counts as one connection in the math, but it's only used this way in Philemon and in 2 Timothy, not in any of the others. It's exclusive to them in a personal letter. And even with the 4 that are just Philemon alone, think about this. There's 145 or so major words, and 4 of those are not used in any of Paul's letters. That means personal letters have language that you're not going to find in corporate ones. I think that we have just done math and not thought through the math. Now, you say, Stephen, does this mean that you're saying that accounts for all the differences and all the words that are... No. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that this needs to be counted with intentionality, not just to make a mathematical point. That's what I'm saying. Number 2, there's a lot of other reasons why the language is different. I think this is a big one. Number 2, Paul is a different age, a different man. By the time the pastorals are written, he's an older man. He's about to die. You can feel the emotion when you're reading 2 Timothy. You could feel the hurt by a man who said he's been abandoned by everybody but Luke. I would not expect the standard of that letter to be compared to Romans or to Galatians, where he is amped up about legalism taking back over the church. I wouldn't expect them to be the same. There's energy, motion, totally different emotions. Anger and frustration toward a church that should know better versus hurt and loneliness, so much that he just wants the comfort of a coat that he left at Troas and his books and his parchment. A man who's alone, knowing death is on his door, is at his door ready to take him. You can't expect them to be the same. He's also older. I can tell you right now, if you look at my undergrad research papers compared to my master's, a lot different. Then you compare my master's versus my first doctorate, a lot different. Then you look at my first doctorate to the one I just completed my PhD with Louisiana Baptist Theological Seminary. You compare that to those, guess what you will find? A lot different. Because as we age and as we develop, we learn more, we say things different. We get into terminology that we find very important to us, and we start talking about it more and more because we learn and we get better educated, and our verbiage changes with our life change. That needs to be taken into consideration too. What's more likely that needs to be considered is Paul had an amanuensis. And there's two things about this. It's possible maybe Luke did it. He said in 2 Timothy he's the only one that's left with him. We don't know. But I do know this. Paul used amanuenses. Romans, he used Tertius. But there were also times where Paul felt it necessary to say to the people, I'm writing this with my own hand. Philemon is one of those places where Paul said, I wrote this with my own hand. I will repay it. He told the Thessalonian church, he wrote with his own hand. He told the Galatian church, he wrote with big letters and his own hand. It is very likely that Paul had horrid eyesight. He tells the Galatians at one point, because of his physical infirmity, that they would have plucked out his eyes for it. And now he's become his enemy because he tells them the truth. Paul apparently had an eye problem. And it could be that's why later he used a amanuensis. Galatians would have been an earlier letter. Philemon would have been likely an earlier letter when he's writing these things with his own hand. And when he did write, he had to write them in big letters, like he told the church at Galatia. Romans is a later letter. That would have been right around 60 AD, 58 to 60 AD. And in Romans, he used a amanuensis. May even use more than one, but Tertius is the one that was commissioned to send the letter that we have preserved today. So maybe as Paul aged, he started using others to write. It makes sense. And if Romans is 58 to 60, these letters are in the mid-60s. How much worse is his eyesight then? How much more does he need an amanuensis then? And he's in prison in a much different way than he would have been in his first imprisonments. Then with the amanuensis, I said there's two things. One, he could have used an amanuensis. Two, how did he use the amanuensis? For example, there's a difference between dictation and oversight. You can dictate to an amanuensis to write these words exactly how you are. That's how Papias told us Mark was written by John Mark for Peter. Then there's also something along these lines. Paul being in prison, in Mamertine prison, can't see as it is, probably in a dark place. He's only visited by some buddies that are left behind, Luke being one of those. Maybe he says to Luke or somebody like that. I'm not saying it's Luke. I'm saying somebody like that and says, Hey, can you write a letter to Timothy? Hey, can you write a letter for Titus? I need you to tell him these things. These are very important that you include this in the letter. And they draw up a draft for Paul. And then they maybe read it back to Paul and say, Paul, what do you think about this? Paul says, well, make sure you include this, or maybe word this a little bit better so he knows that it's me talking here. We don't know. There are multiple reasons, is all I'm getting at, as to why there could be differences. He could have given free liberty to an amanuensis to write up a letter for him that he approved. That's still Pauline's letter. That's still Paul's approval. That's what Luke did for Paul. That's what Luke did in Acts for Paul. He wrote these things for Paul on behalf of Paul. So there's multiple explanations for the differences. We can't just do the math and say, well, it's not Paul. There's so many differences. There's many reasons why the vocab and syntax could have changed, but we still are comparing them to a different genre. And so when we look at it with a more closely connected genre like Philemon, we find, man, I can restructure the book of Philemon with the verbiage and the terminology and the syntax and the phraseology that Paul uses in the pastorals. I can do 85+% reconstruction when we consider the trueness of the words that he uses. And that there's names that are linked there that are nowhere else. And there's terms there that are used only in the pastorals and Philemon. There's much to learn from these comparisons. I'm not saying we've arrived. I'm not saying I've arrived and that's the end of the story. I did that. I'm saying there's more to the story than what the numbers are all about. And we need to look at everything, not just the numbers. We need to look at the church attestation. And I think it's interesting, again, that Irenaeus says Paul made mention of Timothy in his epistle, of Linus in the epistle to Timothy, and that he said these things. Maybe Irenaeus knew he told somebody he was speaking behind these letters. Perhaps. We don't know. All I can say is this is something that we need to consider. I believe they're Pauline, whether he used an amanuensis, whether he gave freedom to the amanuensis and approved his final edits, whatever the case may be, we have a historical reason to link it to Paul. We even have a grammatical reason from Philemon to link the terminology to Paul, some of which are very, very important words like my son, the teknon. I think we have a lot of reason from history and the internal evidence to call it Pauline, and that Paul was behind these letters. I do believe they're Pauline. I'm fine with opposition. I have many friends who disagree with me. That is okay. But I do think we need to consider this from a much deeper angle. Thank you for all the comments that have come in and those that have joined and that will join later. Thank you for tuning in and listening to this program. If you are appreciative of the information you're getting, I ask that you like and subscribe. Follow what we do. This is also going to be partnered up with Explore. So we're in Explore Christianity, but it's also going to be partnered up with Explain International. They're going to be posting this as well. And I know it's also going to be shared on some other pages. If you like this and find this helpful for you, please hit that like button on the right side and subscribe, or on the left side and then subscribe on the right side. We'd appreciate anything that you can give us. If you're appreciative, give us feedback, comment as well. You can find us on our website as well, explorechristianity.net. It's right there on the bottom of your screen. And you can also find my work on the podcast Facts, FACTS. It's an acronym. You can find my work there, all the things that we've done if you just enjoy listening to the audio. Again, thanks for tuning in. I hope this was helpful to you. Share it, like it, and we will do the best we can to continue these series. I'm going to be putting out more. Again, we want to go through the whole Bible, look at all the historical and eternal criteria to give authenticity to the canon of Scripture we have. Grace and peace to you. God bless. Have a good